My name is Trooper Katherine Hayes, and I've been a Wyoming Highway Patrol officer for 21 years now, assigned to the Laramie District, covering Interstate 80 and the surrounding highways through the Medicine Bow Mountains. Before that, I spent 5 years with the Cheyenne Police Department working DUI enforcement and another 3 years as a volunteer search and rescue coordinator in the Snowy Range. I've worked fatal accidents in whiteout conditions where entire families died because they couldn't see 10 feet in front of their vehicle. I've pulled bodies from cars that went off mountain passes and weren't found until spring thaw. I've investigated hit and runs where drunk drivers left people dying in snowbanks and kept driving. And I've dealt with winter road conditions that would make most people understand why Wyoming has one of the highest rates of weather-related traffic fatalities in the nation. I tell you this so you understand that I'm not someone who scares easily, or who believes in ghost stories about haunted highways or phantom hitchhikers. I deal in evidence, in skid marks and impact dynamics, in blood alcohol levels and witness statements and accident reconstruction that can be presented in court. Or at least I did until December 25th, 2023. Before I tell you what happened on a stretch of Highway 287 we call the Frozen Mile, before I explain why I can no longer work Christmas morning shifts and why I keep evergreen branches and silver coins in my patrol vehicle for reasons that would get me sent for a psychological evaluation. If anyone found out, I need you to do something for me. If you're watching this video, if you follow these stories from highway patrol officers and law enforcement who work roads where the boundary between this world and the next becomes dangerously thin, please subscribe and like this video. What I'm about to share violates departmental policy and probably breaks confidentiality regulations. But after what I witnessed, after what I became, staying silent feels like abandoning other officers to face the same terror without warning. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Have you ever driven through Wyoming in winter, through those endless stretches of two-lane highway, where the wind creates ground blizzards even when the sky is clear and the nearest town is 60 miles away? Have you ever felt like something was keeping pace with your vehicle, matching your speed in the darkness just beyond your headlights, waiting for you to make one wrong move? Drop a comment below. Tell me if you felt it. Tell me if you've seen the Christmas travelers. Highway 287 runs north-south through central Wyoming, connecting Laramie to Rawlins and continuing north through the Wind River Basin toward Yellowstone. The section that concerns this story is a 47-mile stretch between Laramie and Medicine Bow, a route that crosses high plains country at elevations between 7,000 and 8,200 feet, exposed to winds that can reach 70 miles per hour, subject to temperature extremes that range from 100 degrees in summer to minus 40 in winter. It's beautiful country in good weather, all rolling grassland and distant mountain views and big sky that goes on forever. But in winter, especially during storms, it becomes one of the most dangerous roads in Wyoming, a place where visibility drops to zero in seconds, where ice forms on the pavement faster than road crews can treat it, where vehicles get blown off the road by crosswinds strong enough to flip semi-trucks. The stretch we call the Frozen Mile is at mile marker 233, about 18 miles north of Laramie, where the highway descends into a shallow valley before climbing back up onto the plains. It's only about a mile and a half long, but that section has the highest accident rate on the entire route, averaging 15 to 20 serious crashes per winter, at least 3 or 4 fatalities per year. The official explanation is that the valley creates a microclimate where cold air pools, where black ice forms even when the rest of the highway is clear, where fog develops suddenly and drivers don't slow down in time. But there's another explanation, one that gets whispered between veteran troopers late at night, one that doesn't appear in any official report. The Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples who lived in this region before European settlement had names for the area around mile marker 233 that translate to where the winter spirits gather, or the cold crossing, or Road of the Frozen Ones. There are accounts from the 1860s of wagon trains that avoided that particular valley, preferring to take longer routes that stayed on higher ground. There are reports from the 1880s, when the Union Pacific Railroad was being built through the region, of work crews who refused to camp in the valley, who claimed they heard voices in the wind, who saw figures moving through snowstorms that looked human but weren't, that left no tracks. There are records from the early automobile era, the 1920s and 1930s, of unusual numbers of accidents and disappearances in that section of road. Drivers who were found frozen in their vehicles even though they had gas and working heaters. Families who vanished between Laramie and Medicine Bow, and whose cars were found abandoned in the valley with no sign of the occupants. Most of that history has been dismissed as frontier superstition or explained away by the harsh climate and primitive road conditions of earlier eras. But those of us who patrol Highway 287, who work that section regularly, who've responded to dozens of accidents in the frozen mile over the years, we know there's something else there. Something that has nothing to do with ice and wind and driver error, and everything to do with a place where the boundary between the living and the dead has worn dangerously thin from too many deaths in too small an area over too many years. December 25th, 2023 started as a clear, brutally cold Christmas morning. I came on duty at 0600 hours for a day shift that would run until 1800 hours, covering for officers who had families and wanted to spend the holiday at home. I'm divorced, no kids, and I'd worked Christmas for the past 8 years running, so it was routine for me. The temperature at the patrol station in Laramie was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds gusting to 40 miles per hour, creating a wind chill of minus 50 or lower. Dangerous cold, the kind that can cause frostbite and exposed skin in less than 5 minutes, the kind that kills stranded motorists in less than an hour if their heat fails. But the sky was clear, the roads were dry, and traffic was light because most sensible people were home with their families. I spent the first few hours of my shift doing routine patrols, checking on a few stranded vehicles whose batteries had died in the cold, helping a rancher whose truck had slid off a county road into a snow-filled ditch, sitting radar on I-80, where a few drivers were going too fast for the conditions. Everything normal, everything routine. Then at 0947 hours, I got a radio call from dispatch that made everything change. They reported a 911 call from a cell phone, caller identifying herself as Jennifer Walsh, saying she and her family were stranded on Highway 287 northbound at approximately mile marker 233. Their vehicle had broken down. They had 3 small children. They were running low on gas and couldn't keep the heater going continuously, and they needed immediate assistance. The temperature was still minus 22, with wind chills approaching minus 60. A family with small children in those conditions had maybe 2 hours before hypothermia became life-threatening, maybe less. I acknowledged the call, and headed north on Highway 287 toward mile marker 233. The location was approximately 18 miles from where I was, maybe 20 minutes in good conditions. As I drove, I had dispatch try to call Jennifer Walsh back to get more details, to advise her on how to conserve heat, to keep her updated on my ETA. Dispatch called back and said the phone went straight to voicemail, which could mean the battery had died or they were in a dead zone, both common in that area. I also had dispatch run Jennifer Walsh through our systems. She came back as a Colorado resident, age 34, clean driving record, registered owner of a 2019 Honda Pilot. Everything checked out as legitimate. I increased my speed, pushing 80 miles per hour on the empty highway, knowing that every minute mattered in those temperatures. At mile marker 230, about 3 miles south of the reported location, I noticed something wrong. The temperature gauge in my patrol vehicle started fluctuating, jumping from -22 to -35 to -15, cycling through different readings without any pattern. I checked the outside temperature sensor. It was reading -48 degrees, 26 degrees colder than it had been just minutes earlier. Cold that didn't make meteorological sense even in Wyoming winter. And my radio started producing interference. Not normal static, but a sound like singing, like children's voices singing Christmas carols, but at frequencies that were slightly off-key, creating harmonies that were beautiful and unsettling simultaneously. I tried calling dispatch to report the radio malfunction. Got nothing but that singing, Silent Night, and Oh Holy Night, and We Wish You a Merry Christmas, all layered over each other, creating a cacophony of holiday music that made my head ache. I checked my cell phone. No signal, not unusual in the valley, but the phone itself was behaving strangely, the screen showing the time as 09:54, then 12:33, then 08:17, jumping through different hours. I looked at my watch, a simple analog watch I've worn since my academy graduation. The second hand was moving, but irregularly, advancing 4 seconds, stopping for 3 seconds, jumping backward 2 seconds, moving forward 5 seconds. Time was behaving wrong. I came over the rise and descended into the valley at mile marker 233, and I saw the vehicle. It was a dark blue Honda Pilot with Colorado plates, stopped on the right shoulder with its hazard lights on. But the lights were flashing at intervals that seemed deliberately irregular, creating a rhythm that was hypnotic and disturbing, like a heartbeat that kept changing tempo. As I approached, I could see figures standing outside the vehicle, a woman and what looked like 3 small children, all facing away from me towards something on the eastern side of the highway. I pulled up behind the Pilot and activated my light bar and spotlight, standard procedure, though everything about the scene was triggering warnings in my gut that nothing about this was standard. The temperature had changed dramatically. When I opened my door, the air that hit me was so cold it took my breath away. Cold that burned my lungs and made my eyes water and freeze instantly. My vehicle's external temperature sensor was now showing -67 degrees, impossibly cold. Temperatures that shouldn't exist outside of Antarctica. But the cold wasn't consistent. As I walked toward the family, I passed through zones of temperature, stepping from brutal cold into areas that felt almost warm, maybe 20 degrees, and back into cold that threatened to freeze exposed skin instantly, like there were invisible boundaries in the air, marking off different climatic regions that had nothing to do with normal winter weather. And I could hear singing, not from my radio anymore, but from the highway itself, From the air, from the ground beneath my feet, children's voices harmonizing in patterns that sounded like Christmas carols, but weren't quite right. Lyrics that I almost recognized, but that didn't match any songs I knew. Melodies that seemed to describe cold and loneliness and the desperate desire to go home for Christmas, but never quite getting there. I called out to the woman and children, identified myself as Wyoming Highway Patrol, asked if they needed assistance. None of them responded. None of them moved. They just stood there, maybe 20 feet from their vehicle, staring at something on the eastern side of the highway. I moved up alongside them, my hand on my weapon, though I had no idea what threat I might be facing, and I saw what they were looking at. There was a procession moving across the highway, not on the pavement, but slightly above it, maybe 6 inches off the ground. Dozens or hundreds of figures moving in a long line from west to east, crossing the road in complete silence, except for that singing. They were families, parents and children, grandparents, entire groups traveling together, dressed in winter clothing from different eras. Some wore pioneer-era garments, heavy wool coats, and bonnets and scarves wrapped around their faces. Some wore clothing from the 1920s and 1930s, the kind of outfits you'd see in Depression-era photographs. Some wore 1950s and 1960s winter gear, practical parkas and boots. Some wore modern winter clothing, North Face jackets and ski pants and insulated gloves. And some wore clothing I couldn't identify at all, garments that looked like they were made from snow itself, from ice crystals and frost, decorated with patterns that shifted and changed when I tried to focus on them. The figures were translucent, like they were made of frozen air, visible, but not quite solid, flickering slightly like images projected through falling snow. And they were all carrying something: suitcases, shopping bags, wrapped presents, Christmas decorations, the things you'd bring if you were traveling home for the holidays, if you were trying to make it to family gatherings, if you were on your way to celebrate Christmas with the people you loved. But these travelers would never arrive. I could see it in their faces, expressions of longing and sorrow and resignation, the look of people who knew they were dead, but who couldn't stop trying to get home, who couldn't accept that they'd never reach their destinations, who were trapped in the eternal journey of trying to complete trips that had been interrupted by accidents and storms and the brutal cold of Wyoming winters. I asked the woman beside me what was happening. She turned her head slowly to look at me, and I saw that her eyes were wrong. Her pupils were dilated so far that there was almost no visible iris, just massive black circles that reflected the strange shifting light from the procession. When she spoke, her voice sounded distant and layered, like multiple people speaking the same words with slight delays. "They're the Christmas travelers," she said, "the ones who died trying to get home for the holidays, the families who crashed in storms while driving to see relatives, the people who froze when their cars broke down on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, the children who never made it to Grandma's house, who never opened their presents, who never had their Christmas dinners. Everyone who's died on this stretch of highway during the holiday season for the past 150 years. They walk on Christmas morning because that's when the boundary is thinnest, when the desire to be home is strongest, when the weight of all that longing and grief makes the veil between worlds permeable enough for them to appear. They're trying to complete their journeys. They're trying to get home, but they never arrive. They just walk, forever crossing this highway, forever trying to reach destinations they'll never see, forever 1 mile away from family gatherings that happened decades ago or that will never happen because they died before they could get there. I asked her how she knew this. She smiled, and it was not a comforting smile. Her lips blue from cold, her teeth chattering. They told us, she said. They've been telling us since we stopped. They speak in Christmas carols, and in the sound of wind through frozen trees, and in the ringing of bells that no one hung. They want us to understand. They want us to know that this highway is not just a road. It's a threshold. It's a place where so many people have died trying to get home that death itself has become embedded in the pavement, in the air, in the fundamental structure of this place. The frozen mile isn't just a dangerous section of road. It's a collection point. It's where the spirits of everyone who died traveling home for Christmas gather, where they walk their eternal procession, where they try over and over to complete journeys that were interrupted by tragedy. And every Christmas morning, when the boundary is thin enough, they become visible. And sometimes they recruit. Sometimes they invite the living to join them, to stop fighting the cold, to step out of broken down vehicles and walk with them, to become part of the procession that never ends. The singing from the procession grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the children in the translucent families, dozens or hundreds of kids who died before they could celebrate Christmas, who were still trying to get to family gatherings, who were singing carols as they walked, because that's what families did on Christmas morning, because singing made the journey feel less lonely, because maybe if they sang loud enough, someone would hear them and help them find their way home. One of Jennifer Walsh's children, a girl who looked maybe 6 years old, suddenly turned to look at me with those same dilated pupils. When she spoke, her voice harmonized with itself, creating chords that shouldn't be possible from a child's throat. They want you to see them, officer. They want you to understand. Come closer. Walk to the edge of the road. Stand at the boundary between the pavement and the shoulder. Let them measure you. Let them decide if you're worthy to walk with them, if you understand what it means to want to go home so badly that even death can't stop you from trying. I should have gotten all of them into my patrol vehicle right then. I should have called for emergency medical services, should have treated this as severe hypothermia with altered mental status, should have followed every protocol for cold weather rescue. But my radio wasn't working and my phone showed impossible times, and I was standing on Highway 287 in minus 67-degree cold, watching a procession of translucent figures carrying Christmas presents and singing carols. And this family was speaking with voices that harmonized with themselves and telling me about travelers who died trying to get home. So I did the only thing I could think of. I walked to the edge of the road, walked to where the pavement met the shoulder, close enough to see the procession more clearly, close enough to understand what I was looking at. The figures weren't solid in the way living people are solid. They were more like recordings, like images captured from different time periods and projected into the same space, overlapping and interweaving. I could see through them to the valley beyond, but I could also see details on their faces, on the presents they carried, on the Christmas decorations they held. A woman from the 1930s carrying a pie, probably taking it to a family dinner she never reached. A man from the 1950s with a toy train set wrapped in paper, decorated with Santa Claus, a present for a child who never got to open it. A family from the 1980s with suitcases covered in travel stickers. Their vacation interrupted by a storm they didn't survive. A couple from the early 2000s with wrapped gifts and a small Christmas tree strapped to the roof of a translucent car that moved with them. Their holiday celebration cut short by black ice and a rollover accident. Each figure carried evidence of the Christmas they'd been trying to have, the celebrations they'd been traveling to, the families they'd been hoping to see. And all of them had that same expression: longing mixed with sorrow, mixed with determination. The look of people who knew they were dead, but who couldn't stop trying, who couldn't accept that the journeys they'd started would never be completed. I could feel them watching me. I could feel their attention focusing on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle despite the brutal cold. And I could hear the singing more clearly now, understand that it wasn't just carols, but prayers, pleas, desperate attempts to communicate with the living, to make us understand that they needed help, that the boundary between worlds had become so thin in this place that sometimes the dead could almost reach through, could almost touch the living, could almost complete their journeys if only someone would help them cross that final threshold. One of the figures near the front of the procession moved closer. A woman wearing clothing from the 1970s, carrying a shopping bag full of wrapped presents. Her mouth didn't open, but I heard a voice in my mind, not through my ears, but directly in my consciousness, speaking in English, but with an accent I couldn't place, using phrasings that sounded old-fashioned, dated. "You are a guardian," the voice said, "one who patrols this road, who helps travelers in distress, who tries to keep people safe. We were travelers once. We had destinations. We had families waiting for us. We had Christmas dinners getting cold, and children wondering why we weren't there, and parents watching the driveway hoping to see our headlights. But we never arrived. We died on this road, in storms and accidents and brutal cold, and we became part of the threshold, part of the boundary between the living world and the world of the dead. We walk on Christmas morning because that's when the longing is strongest, when the desire to be home is most powerful, when the membrane between worlds becomes thin enough for us to appear. We're not trying to harm anyone. We're just trying to get home. But we can't cross the final boundary alone. We need help from the living. We need someone who understands what we are, who honors our desire to complete our journeys, who can help maintain the balance between the world of the living and the world of the dead along this road. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse from the cold. I asked what they wanted from me. The voice in my mind answered with patient precision. We want you to witness. We want you to understand that this highway is more than just pavement and paint. It's a pathway between worlds. Everyone who dies here becomes part of the road, becomes part of the infrastructure that connects the living and the dead. Without witnesses, without people who can perceive us and honor what we do, the boundary becomes unstable. The dead become confused, start appearing to living travelers, causing accidents, creating fear. The living become trapped, cross into our world without realizing it, become part of the procession without understanding what happened to them. We need bridges. We need people who exist in both worlds, who can help maintain the boundary, who can make sure that when Christmas comes and the membrane thins, both the living and the dead stay in their proper realms. I thought about refusing. I thought about getting back in my patrol vehicle and calling for backup and requesting that someone else handle this call. Someone who hadn't seen what I was seeing. Someone who could maintain the comfortable fiction that this was just a family with a broken down car in dangerous cold. But I was standing on Highway 287 at mile marker 233, the frozen mile, watching a procession of Christmas travelers who'd been dead for decades or generations, being told that the road I patrolled every day was also a threshold between life and death, that my duty extended beyond traffic enforcement into maintaining boundaries between worlds. I thought about all the accidents I'd worked in this section over the years, the fatal crashes that never quite made sense, the single vehicle rollovers on clear roads, the families found frozen in vehicles that still had gas and working heaters. I thought about the other troopers who'd mentioned strange experiences in the frozen mile, sightings they dismissed as stress or exhaustion, voices they heard in the wind, figures they saw in their mirrors that disappeared when they looked directly. I thought about my responsibility to protect travelers, to keep the highway safe, to prevent deaths if possible, and to understand deaths when they occurred. And I thought about something my training officer had told me when I first joined the patrol. Advice I'd taken as metaphorical, but that suddenly made literal sense. He'd said that in Wyoming, where roads stretch across vast empty country and winter can kill in minutes, troopers had to understand that they weren't just enforcing traffic laws, but maintaining boundaries, keeping the living safe and the dead at rest, making sure that the loneliness and danger of the roads didn't create places where the two worlds mixed. I reached into my patrol vehicle and pulled out an evergreen branch I'd picked up that morning, a piece of a wreath that had fallen off someone's car, something I'd kept meaning to throw away but had forgotten about. I held it out toward the figure that had spoken in my mind, an offering, a gesture of respect, acknowledgement that what they were doing mattered, that their eternal journey deserved to be honored, even if it could never be completed. "I witness," I said. Just those two words, but they were enough. The figure moved closer, and I felt something change in my perception, like a veil being lifted from my vision, like a frequency I'd been unable to hear suddenly becoming audible. The highway around me shifted. I could see more now. The physical world was still there, the pavement and the shoulder, and the valley, and Jennifer Walsh and her children. But overlaying it was another layer, a transparent version of the same highway, but populated with figures, hundreds of them, thousands of them, all traveling in different directions, all carrying evidence of Christmases they never got to celebrate, all walking roads that led to destinations they'd never reach. I could see their paths worn into the pavement, spiritual trails that glowed faintly, routes they'd been walking for years or decades or generations, trying over and over to complete journeys that had been interrupted by death. And I could see the places where the boundary was thinnest. At mile marker 233, where I was standing, the membrane between worlds was almost transparent, so thin that living and dead were mixing, where cars from my world drove through spaces occupied by the procession from the other world, where neither side fully perceived the other, but where the proximity created interference, confusion, danger. This explained the accidents. This explained why so many people crashed in this exact location, why drivers reported seeing things that weren't there, why vehicles swerved for no apparent reason. They were trying to avoid the procession, trying not to hit figures that existed in a different layer of reality, trying to navigate a road that was actually two roads occupying the same space, one for the living and one for the dead. One of the male figures, a man wearing clothing from the 1940s and carrying a suitcase, moved beside me and spoke in my mind. You will see us now. Always. Whenever you patrol this section, you will perceive the procession. You will understand when the boundary is too thin, when living travelers are in danger of crossing into our world, when dead travelers are appearing in yours. You will become a keeper of the threshold, making sure that both sides respect the boundary, that the living understand this is a dangerous place requiring caution and respect, that the dead understand they must complete their walking without interfering with the journeys of those still alive. This is what it means to witness. This is the price of acceptance. The procession began to fade, not disappearing, but becoming less visible, returning to the frequency where they existed just below normal perception. The highway returned to normal appearance, the overlay becoming faint, translucent, visible only when I concentrated on perceiving it. Jennifer Walsh and her children blinked, their pupils contracting to normal size, their expressions shifting from that strange, distant harmonization to confusion and fear. Jennifer looked at me and said in a normal voice, "Officer, what happened? Our car broke down and we stopped and then, I don't remember. Did we black out? Are the kids okay?" I assured them they were fine, that they'd experienced some disorientation from the extreme cold, that their vehicle had probably had a fuel line freeze and stalled. I got all of them into my patrol vehicle, cranked the heat to maximum, wrapped them in emergency blankets. I called for a tow on my radio, which was suddenly working again, and stayed with them until the truck arrived 45 minutes later. None of them remembered the procession. None of them remembered the Christmas travelers or the singing or anything they'd said in those harmonized voices. For them, it was just a scary episode where their car broke down in dangerous cold, nothing more. The tow truck driver was able to get their pilot started after thawing the fuel line, and I followed them all the way to Medicine Bow to make sure they made it safely, to make sure they completed their journey without becoming part of the procession themselves. But I remembered everything. And now, when I patrol Highway 287, when I drive through the frozen mile at mile marker 233, I see both layers of reality simultaneously. I see the physical highway with living travelers going about their business. And I see the procession, the Christmas travelers walking their eternal paths, carrying their presents and their decorations and their desperate hope that maybe this year, maybe this Christmas, they'll finally make it home. I spent the weeks after that Christmas morning researching everything I could find about accidents in the frozen mile, about the history of travel through that valley, about indigenous beliefs regarding roads and journeys and the spaces where travelers die. I found records documenting over 300 fatalities on that section of Highway 287 since the 1860s, when the first wagon roads were established through the area. I found patterns suggesting that a disproportionate number of those deaths occurred during the holiday season, late November through early January, times when people were traveling to see family, when they were in a hurry to reach destinations, when they were carrying gifts and hope and anticipation. I found newspaper accounts from different eras describing unusual accidents in the valley, reports of drivers who claimed they'd swerved to avoid people in the road who weren't there when investigators arrived, families who were found frozen in their vehicles even though they'd had adequate fuel and functioning heaters, as if they'd simply given up and stopped trying to stay warm. I found Arapaho and Cheyenne oral histories describing the valley as a thin place, a location where the boundary between worlds was permeable, where spirits gathered, where travelers needed to show special respect and caution. And I found something else, a Wyoming Highway Patrol internal memo from 1967, marked confidential and archived in the basement of the Laramie District Office, documenting unusual reports from troopers patrolling Highway 287, recommending that officers be advised to use extra caution in the mile marker 233 area during the holiday season, suggesting that some accidents in that location might have non-standard contributing factors that wouldn't appear in official reports. The recommendations were never formally implemented, but some of the practices described in the memo had somehow become unofficial protocol. Warnings passed down between veteran troopers, unwritten rules about avoiding solo patrols in the frozen mile on Christmas morning, suggestions about leaving small offerings at certain locations, acknowledgments that something about that section of highway was different, wrong, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with ice and wind. The mark appeared about 5 weeks after that Christmas morning. I was changing after my shift and noticed a pattern on my left shoulder, designs that looked like a road map, lines that corresponded to Highway 287, but that also showed other routes, spiritual pathways that the Christmas travelers used, connections between this world and the next that existed in the metaphysical geography of the region. It looked like a scar from a burn, but I'd never been injured there, and it definitely hadn't been present the day before. The mark is always cold to the touch, maybe 10 degrees colder than the rest of my skin, and when I concentrate on it, I can see the overlay more clearly, can perceive the procession and their work even when I'm miles from the frozen mile. I've met 9 other officers with variations of the mark since then. One is a veteran trooper who's worked northern Wyoming for 35 years and who drives the same routes the Christmas travelers walk. One is a Cheyenne ranger who learned about threshold places from his grandfather and who performs ceremonies at sites where people have died. One is a tow truck operator who's recovered countless vehicles from the frozen mile and who speaks carefully about the ones who don't make it home. One is a coroner who's examined bodies from winter accidents and who sees patterns that don't appear in autopsy reports. One is a search and rescue coordinator who's found people alive when they should have been dead, and dead when they should have been alive, like they'd crossed boundaries they didn't understand. One is a Weather Service meteorologist who tracks temperature anomalies in the valley that don't match any atmospheric models. One is a radio dispatcher who sometimes hears voices on emergency calls that don't belong to the callers. One is a highway maintenance supervisor who sees things while plowing snow in the pre-dawn darkness that make him question reality. One is a chaplain who provides death notifications to families and who understands that some journeys are never completed, that some travelers become part of the roads they died on, that Christmas grief has a particular weight that can anchor souls to places for generations. We all have stories. We all have encounters with the Christmas travelers, with the procession that walks the frozen mile every Christmas morning. We don't talk about it openly. We can't. But we recognize each other. We know the look in each other's eyes, the weight of witnessing, the burden of maintaining boundaries that most people don't know exist. I requested a transfer to a different district 8 months ago. The request was denied by my commander without explanation. My sergeant, a trooper who's worked the Laramie area for 28 years, pulled me aside after I received the denial. Some officers patrol because they're good at traffic enforcement, he said. Others stay in specific areas because they have knowledge that area requires. You have that knowledge now. Highway 287 needs someone who understands what walks the frozen mile on Christmas morning, who can make sure that when we work accidents in that section, someone recognizes when living travelers are in danger of crossing into the world of the dead, when dead travelers are interfering with the living. That's you now. The commander knows it. The older troopers know it. Anyone who's worked this highway long enough knows that there are aspects of road safety that don't appear in any manual, that can't be addressed with traffic control or weather warnings, that require officers who can see beyond the physical road. I think there's a network throughout Wyoming Highway Patrol, throughout all agencies that work the roads in places where winter kills regularly, officers and emergency responders who understand what certain highways really are, who work to maintain both the physical safety and the spiritual integrity of the roads. They're the ones who know where offerings need to be left, who perform informal remembrances at sites where people have died, who teach newer officers the unwritten rules about respecting roads as more than just pavement, about understanding that places where many people have died trying to reach the same destination can become threshold places, boundary zones where the living and dead share the same space without fully perceiving each other. I'm recording this because the Christmas travelers asked me to, because they said that knowledge needs to be shared, that more officers need to understand what they're patrolling, that the boundary will continue to fail unless people on both sides, living and dead, work together to maintain it. This is me sharing what I know. This is me telling you that Highway 287 through the Frozen Mile is more than just a dangerous section of road. It's a threshold between worlds. It's a place where 150 years of Christmas travelers who died trying to get home have worn the boundary so thin that on Christmas morning, when longing and grief are strongest, they become visible. They walk their eternal procession, carrying presents that will never be opened, traveling to family gatherings that happened generations ago or that will never happen. Forever 1 mile from home, forever crossing that valley, forever hoping that maybe this year they'll finally arrive. If you drive Highway 287, especially during the holidays, especially in winter, respect the road. Slow down in the frozen mile. Pay attention to your surroundings. If you see figures in the road, don't assume they're not there just because they look wrong. The Christmas travelers are real. The procession is real. And the boundary between the living and the dead in that place is so thin that sometimes they mix. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes the dead try to warn the living about dangers ahead. And sometimes the living accidentally cross into the world of the dead without understanding what they've done. Most people drive through the frozen mile and see nothing but highway. But some can see deeper. Some can perceive the layer of death that overlays the pavement, can see the thousands of Christmas travelers who walk that road every year, trying to complete journeys that were interrupted by tragedy, can understand that every mile of that highway is maintained not just by road crews and highway patrol, but by the dead, who walk it eternally, who keep trying to get home, who sing Christmas carols as they travel, because singing makes the loneliness bearable. Because maybe if they sing loud enough, someone will hear them and help them find their way. I'll be out there tomorrow. I'll be out there every day for the foreseeable future. I'll be patrolling Highway 287, and especially the Frozen Mile, watching for accidents, but also watching for places where the boundary is too thin, where living travelers are in danger of seeing the procession, where dead travelers are becoming too visible in the world of the living. I'll be maintaining my duty to keep the highway safe while honoring my responsibility to the Christmas travelers, using the knowledge I gained that December morning to keep both sides of the boundary functioning. That's my job now. That's the price I pay for witnessing, for accepting the mark, for becoming a keeper of the threshold. The procession is always walking. The Christmas travelers are always trying to get home. And somewhere on Highway 287, at mile marker 233, in a valley where the boundary between worlds has worn dangerously thin, spirits who died trying to celebrate Christmas with their families continue their eternal journey, one step at a time, one carol at a time, one desperate attempt at a time to complete trips that were interrupted by weather and accidents and the brutal indifference of Wyoming winter, waiting for the day when someone will finally help them cross that last threshold, when someone will finally help them get home. My name is Trooper Katherine Hayes, Wyoming Highway Patrol, Keeper of the Threshold, Witness to the Christmas Travelers, Guardian of the Frozen Mile. Welcome to Highway 287. The road is real. The danger is real. And somewhere just below the frequency of normal perception, thousands of Christmas travelers continue their eternal procession, walking the boundary between this world and the next, carrying presents they'll never deliver, singing carols to ease the loneliness, forever trying to get home, forever 1 mile short of destinations they'll never reach, waiting for Christmas morning when the boundary thins, and maybe, just maybe, someone will see them and understand that the greatest tragedy isn't dying on the road, but dying while trying to get home to the people you love.